The autumn wind carried the smell of pine and wet earth through the forest of northern Montana, and Marcus Vance breathed it in as he walked a familiar trail back to his cabin, his rifle slung over his shoulder and his mind empty of everything except the quiet beauty of the woods. He called home. He had lived alone for 7 years now, ever since he left the military with too many memories and not enough reasons to stay around people. And the forest had become his sanctuary, his church, his medicine for the wounds that nobody could see. Marcus was 52 years old, with gray streaking through his dark hair and lines carved deep into his face from years of sun and sorrow. But his body was still strong, and his hands were still steady, and he moved through the wilderness like a man who belonged there. The crash came without warning. A crash came without warning. A cant sound like thunder split the evening sky, followed by the shriek of something tearing through the atmosphere. And Marcus dropped to one knee instinctively, his old training taking over before his mind could catch up. He watched a streak of fire arc across the darkening sky and disappear behind the tree line to the east. And the impact shook the ground beneath his feet like a small earthquake. For a long moment, he stayed still, listening, thinking, weighing his options. And then he stood and began moving toward the crash site, because that was simply who he was. It took him 20 minutes to find the crater. Trees had been shattered in a wide circle. Their trunks snapped like matchsticks. And at the center of the destruction lay the twisted remains of something that was definitely not an airplane. Something silver and organic looking with curves that no human engineer had ever designed. And beside the wreckage, curled into a ball and shaking, was a girl. Marcus stopped at the edge of the crater, his breath catching in his throat as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. She looked young, maybe 12 or 13 by human standards, with skin the color of pale lavender and hair like spun silver that fell past her shoulders. And from her back rose 2 magnificent wings, feathered and iridescent, catching the last light of the sunset in shades of purple and blue and gold. One of those wings was bent at a terrible angle, and something that looked like liquid starlight was leaking from the wound. The girl lifted her head and saw him, and she screamed. The sound was raw and terrified and utterly alien, and she scrambled backward against the wreckage, her good wing flaring out in a desperate attempt to make herself look larger. Her eyes wide with panic, she shouted something at him in a language he had never heard, words that clicked and sang and rose and fell like music. But the meaning was clear enough in any language. Stay away from me. Marcus did not run, and he did not reach for his rifle. Instead, he slowly knelt down in the dirt, laid his weapon on the ground, and held up his empty hands where she could see them. "Hey there," he said softly, keeping his voice low and calm the way he would with a wounded animal. "I am not going to hurt you. Okay, I promise. I just want to help." She did not understand his words, but something in his tone must have reached her, because her screaming faded into frightened whimpers, and she watched him with those strange violet eyes as he stayed perfectly still and let her look at him. Minutes passed, and neither of them moved. Finally, Marcus pointed at her injured wing and then at himself, and he mimed the motion of bandaging a wound, hoping she would understand. "Your wing is hurt," he said gently, "and if we do not fix it, you are going to bleed out right here in these woods. So I need you to trust me. Can you do that? Can you let me help you?" The girl stared at him for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression, some of the fear giving way to desperate hope. And she gave a tiny nod. Marcus moved slowly, so slowly, approaching her the way he would approach a deer that might bolt at any moment. And when he finally reached her side, she flinched but did not pull away. Up close, he could see how young she really was. Just a child despite the alien features, and her face was streaked with tears that glowed faintly silver in the growing darkness. "All right," he murmured, examining the damaged wing with careful hands. This is going to hurt, and I am sorry for that. But I have to set this bone, or it will never heal right." She did not understand his words, but she seemed to understand his intent. And she gritted her teeth and nodded again. The sound she made when he set the wing was heartbreaking. A cry of pure agony that echoed through the empty forest. But she did not fight him, and when it was done, she slumped against him. Exhausted and trembling, Marcus used his jacket to create a makeshift splint and bound the wing as best he could with strips torn from his shirt. And then he gathered the girl into his arms and stood. She weighed almost nothing, light-boned and delicate like a bird. And she pressed her face against his chest as he began the long walk back to his cabin. It took him 2 hours to carry her home through the darkening forest. And by the time he laid her on his bed, she was barely conscious. Her breathing shallow and her skin cold to the touch, he worked through the night, cleaning her wounds with supplies from his first aid kit, stitching the worst of her cuts with a needle and fishing line, because that was all he had, forcing her to drink water and checking her temperature every hour. She was not human. He could see that clearly, but she was hurt, and she was young, and she was scared. And that was enough for him. By morning, her fever had broken, and she was sleeping peacefully, her good wing wrapped around herself like a blanket. And Marcus sat in his chair beside the bed and watched over her. Did not know what she was, or where she came from, or what any of this meant for the world. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he was going to take care of this child until she was strong enough to take care of herself. And nothing in the universe was going to stop him. That was simply the kind of man Marcus Vance was. And no amount of alien strangeness could change that simple truth when she woke 3 days later and spoke her first word in broken English. Pointing at herself and saying, "Caliph," Marcus smiled and pointed at himself. "Marcus," he replied. And she repeated it back to him in her musical voice. And that was the beginning of everything. 20 years had passed since the night Marcus found the winged girl in the woods. And in that time, the world had continued turning as it always did. Unaware of the miracle that had happened in a small cabin in Montana, Marcus was 72 now, his hair completely white and his movements slower than they used to be. But his eyes were still sharp and his heart was still strong. And he lived his quiet life among the trees as he always had. He thought about Caliph often, wondered where she was and what she was doing, hoped that she had found her way home and built a good life for herself among the stars. She had stayed with him for 3 months, while her wing healed. And in that time, he had taught her English and she had taught him wonder. And they had formed a bond that transcended species and language and everything else that should have kept them apart. He had taught her how to fish in the cold mountain streams and how to build a fire that would last through the night, how to identify edible plants and how to read the weather in the clouds, how to laugh again after whatever terrible thing had brought her crashing down to earth. And she had told him, in her halting English, about the galaxy beyond the sky. Her people were called the Alari. She had explained, an ancient civilization that ruled 1,000 worlds and had mastered technologies that humans could not even imagine. And they were proud and beautiful and powerful beyond measure, but they were also cold. She had admitted with sadness in her violet eyes, for they had grown so advanced that they had forgotten how to care for the weak. And their laws said that anyone stranded on an unlisted world like Earth must be left behind because the effort of rescue was not worth the cost. She was a princess of the ascendancy, daughter of a great house, and yet by the laws of her own people, she was already considered dead, abandoned. Forgotten. Marcus had listened to all of this, and then he had shrugged and handed her a cup of hot coffee. "Sounds like your people could use some lessons in being decent," he had said. And she had laughed for the first time since her crash, a sound like bells ringing in a clear morning sky on her last night. She had stood on his porch with her wings fully healed and gleaming in the moonlight. And she had cried because she did not want to leave. "I have fixed my distress beacon," she had whispered. "And a ship will come for me before dawn, and I must go back, Marcus. I must go back because there are things I need to change." He had nodded and reached into his pocket and pulled out an old brass compass, dented and scratched and completely useless by galactic standards. "Take this," he had said, pressing it into her hands, "so you can always find your way back." She had thrown her arms around him and held him tight. And then she had spread her wings and vanished into the night sky. And Marcus had watched her go until even the light of the ship that came for her disappeared among the stars. That was 20 years ago, and he had never seen her again. But he had never stopped hoping. Then came the day the sky went dark. Marcus was sitting on his porch when it happened, drinking his morning coffee and listening to the birds. And suddenly, the light changed, dimmed, as if a cloud had passed over the sun. But when he looked up, he saw that it was not a cloud. Ships filled the sky, hundreds of them, massive and dark and ugly, descending through the atmosphere like a swarm of metal locusts. And even from here he could hear the distant boom of their engines as they spread out across the horizon. He went inside and turned on his old radio. And what he heard made his blood run cold. The invaders were called the Varax, the panicked newscaster explained. An alien empire that conquered worlds and stripped them of resources and enslaved their populations. And they had come to Earth because humanity was weak and alone and had no one to protect them. Major cities were already burning. The newscaster continued, and the militaries of the world were fighting back, but their weapons were useless against the alien technology. And this might be the end of everything. Marcus sat in his chair and listened to the reports of destruction and death. And he felt something he had not felt in a long time. Helplessness. He was an old man in the middle of nowhere. And there was nothing he could do to stop an alien invasion. Nothing he could do to save his world. And for the first time in decades, he felt truly afraid. 3 days passed in darkness and despair. News grew worse with every hour as more cities fell and more people died. And Marcus began to make peace with the idea that this was how it would end. That humanity would be wiped out or enslaved, and there was nothing anyone could do about it then. On the morning of the 4th day, everything changed. A new sound filled the sky, different from the ugly roar of the Varax ships. A sound like music, like crystal bells ringing in harmony. And Marcus stumbled out onto his porch and looked up. A second fleet was descending through the clouds. Ships of silver and gold with sweeping elegant lines that made the Varax vessels look like crude machines. And they moved with a grace that took his breath away. He knew those ships. Knew them from the drawings Calith had made for him all those years ago. Knew them because she had described them in loving detail while sitting by his fire. The Allery had come to Earth at the head of the formation, flew a flagship larger than the rest, its hull gleaming like polished starlight. And painted on its side in letters he could somehow read was a name that made his old heart skip a beat. Ship was called Vance's Compass. Marcus sank down onto the steps of his porch and wept. Not from sadness, but from an overwhelming flood of joy and relief and gratitude. Because she had not forgotten, she had not abandoned them. She had come back, and even though he was just one old man on a tiny planet at the edge of nowhere, he knew in that moment that everything was going to be okay. Calith had returned, and she had brought the fire of the stars with her. High Admiral Calith Sorvin stood on the bridge of her flagship and looked down at the blue and green world that had saved her life 20 years ago. And her heart burned with a fury she had never known before. The Varax had already done terrible damage. She could see the smoke rising from the burning cities even from orbit. And the sight of it made her wings flare with rage. "Admiral," her second-in-command said from beside her, "the Varax commander is hailing us. He demands to know why we are interfering in their conquest." Kella smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Only cold steel. "Open a channel," she commanded. and broadcast on all frequencies. I want every Varak ship and every human radio to hear what I'm about to say." The communication officer nodded and made it so. And Keleth stepped forward to address the enemy. "Varak's Dominion," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "I am High Admiral Keleth Sorvin of the Alari Ascendancy, and I am ordering you to withdraw from this world immediately." Laughter crackled through the speakers, harsh and mocking, and the Varak's commander appeared on the view screen. A massive creature with scaled skin and too many teeth. "The Alari," he sneered, "have no claim to this primitive mudball. Your laws forbid you from even acknowledging its existence. So why do you throw away your honor for these worthless ground crawlers?" Caleth's eyes blazed with violet fire. 20 years ago," she said, "I fell to this world, broken and dying, and by every law of my people, I should have been left to rot. But a human found me, a single primitive ground-dwelling human, and he saved my life." She stepped closer to the screen, her wings spreading wide. "He did not save me for profit or power or alliance. He saved me because I was crying, and that was reason enough for him. And that one act of simple kindness taught me more about true civilization than 1,000 years of Alori history." Her voice dropped to something dangerous and quiet. "So hear me now. Varaks, you will not touch this planet. You will not harm these people. You will not lay a single claw on the world that raised the man who saved me. And if you try, I will personally tear your empire apart ship by ship until there is nothing left but dust and memory." The Varak's commander laughed again. "You are outnumbered 3-1. Admiral, your noble speech means nothing against superior firepower." Keleth smiled. "Then let us test that theory." The battle began. The Alari fleet moved like dancers, graceful and deadly, their weapons carving lines of light through the enemy formation. And the Varaks responded with overwhelming force, their crude but powerful guns filling the void with destruction. Keleth commanded from the front, her flagship leading every charge, her tactical genius turning the tide of skirmishes throughout the battlefield. And her crew followed her with absolute loyalty because they believed in what she was fighting for. But the Varaks were relentless. And for every ship they destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place. "Admiral," her weapons officer called out, "we are taking heavy casualties. The enemy is adapting to our tactics. At this rate, we will be overwhelmed within the hour." Keleth gripped the railing of her command platform and refused to give in to despair. There had to be a way. There had to be something she was missing. Then her sensor officer spoke with confusion in his voice. "Admiral, I am detecting new contacts rising from the planet's surface, hundreds of them. But they are not Alari, and they are not Varaks." Keleth looked at the tactical display and felt her breath catch. The humans were coming. They rose from the burning world in everything they had. Fighter jets that were centuries behind galactic technology, hastily modified rockets carrying makeshift weapons, civilian aircraft fitted with guns and bombs. Anything and everything that could fly and fight it was suicide. Everyone on the bridge knew it was suicide. These primitive machines had no chance against the Varak's warships. They would be swatted from the sky like insects, but they came anyway. Eleth watched the human pilots fly their hopeless mission, and something shifted inside her. Something profound and powerful. And she finally understood what Marcus had tried to teach her all those years ago. They are not fighting because they can win, she whispered to herself. They are fighting because it is right. She opened a channel to the human forces, not knowing if they could even receive her transmission. "All human vessels," she called out. "This is Admiral Keleth Sorvin of the Alari fleet. Form on my wing. We finish this together." To her amazement, a voice crackled back, rough and determined and utterly human. "Copy that, Admiral. We are with you. Let us show these bastards what happens when they mess with our planet." The combined assault was unlike anything the Varaks had ever faced. Alari provided the firepower and the shields, creating corridors of safety through the enemy formation. And the humans flew through those corridors with reckless bravery, their primitive weapons finding gaps in the Varax armor that more sophisticated systems had missed. It was chaos, and it was beautiful, and it was working. Kalith led the final charge herself, her flagship screaming toward the Varax command ship with a swarm of human fighters at her side. And together they broke through the enemy defenses and delivered the killing blow. The Varax command ship exploded in a ball of fire that lit up the sky. And without their leader, the enemy fleet shattered and fled. Jumping to hyperspace in desperate retreat, a ragged cheer rose from both fleets, Alari and human voices joining together in celebration. And Keleth allowed herself a moment of exhausted satisfaction. They had won. Earth was saved, and somewhere down on that beautiful blue world, an old man was waiting for her to come home. The battle was over, and the enemy was gone. But Keleth could not rest, not yet. Not until she had done the one thing she had been dreaming about for 20 years. She left her officers in command of the fleet and climbed into a small shuttle. And she flew down through the atmosphere alone, following a path burned into her memory by 2 decades of longing. The world below her was wounded but not broken. Cities still smoldering, but already showing signs of life as people emerged from their hiding places to look up at the clear sky with wonder and relief. She flew over mountains and rivers and forests, and the beauty of it made her heart ache because she had forgotten how much she loved this planet, how much it felt like home, even though she had only lived here for 3 short months. Finally, she saw it, the cabin in the woods, still standing, untouched by the war, as if some force had protected it from harm. She landed in the clearing and stepped out of her shuttle. And there he was. Marcus sat on the porch steps, older now, so much older. His hair white as snow and his face lined with years, but his eyes were the same. Still sharp and kind and full of quiet strength, he looked at her and smiled. And that smile broke something inside her that she had been holding together for far too long. "You came back," he said simply, as if she had only been gone for a few days instead of 20 years. Kalith tried to speak, but the words would not come, and instead she ran to him, her wings folding back as she dropped to her knees before him and buried her face in her hands. "I tried," she sobbed. "I tried to come sooner, but my people would not allow it. They said Earth was beneath us. They said you were primitives not worth our attention. And I fought them, Marcus. I fought them every day for 20 years. Trying to change their minds, trying to make them see what I saw." Her whole body shook with the force of her weeping. All the grief and guilt and longing she had carried for so long finally breaking free. "I never forgot you," she whispered. "Not for one single day. I never forgot what you did for me, what you taught me, who you showed me I could be." Marcus reached down and placed his weathered hand on her head, just as he had done when she was a frightened child bleeding in the woods. "I know," he said gently. "I saw what you did up there. I watched your fleet tear through those invaders like they were made of paper. And I thought to myself, that is my girl. That is the little bird I found crying in the forest." Keleth looked up at him with tears streaming down her lavender cheeks. "You are not angry with me for taking so long," Marcus laughed, a warm sound that chased away some of the shadows in her heart. "Kid, you brought an entire armada across the galaxy to save my planet. I think that buys you a little forgiveness for being late." He reached out and wiped the tears from her face with rough but tender fingers. "Now come inside and sit down. You look like you could use some coffee." They sat at his kitchen table just as they had done 20 years ago, and they talked through the night, sharing stories of the years they had spent apart. Kalith told him about her rise through the ranks of the Alori military, how she had worked harder than anyone else, pushed herself further than anyone thought possible, all so that she could gain enough power to protect the world that had saved Hirsch. She told him about the resistance she had faced, The politicians who called her obsessed, the admirals who questioned her sanity, the endless parade of obstacles that had stood between her and her mission. And she told him about the moment she had received word that the Viracs were heading for Earth. How something inside her had snapped. How she had gathered her fleet and given the order to move without waiting for permission from the Ascendancy Council. "They will probably execute me for this," she admitted quietly. "I broke every law, defied every protocol, committed what amounts to treason against my own government." She lifted her chin with defiance. "And I would do it again in a heartbeat." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. And then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and metal. Keyleth gasped. It was the compass. The old brass compass she had given back to him the night she left. And it looked exactly the same as it had 2 decades ago. "Worn and dented and beautiful. I kept it," Marcus said, pressing it into her hands. "Figured you might need it again someday. It always seemed to bring good luck." Keyleth clutched the compass to her chest and felt fresh tears spilling down her face. "I thought you would have forgotten me by now," she whispered. Marcus shook his head with a small smile. "Keyleth, you were the best thing that ever happened to this old soldier. How could I ever forget the little girl who fell from the stars and taught me that miracles were real?" They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun began to rise outside the window. And Keyleth felt something she had not felt in a very long time, peace whatever happened next. Whatever punishment awaited her back among the stars. She knew that this moment had made it all worthwhile. She had come home. And the man who had saved her was still there, still kind. Still the same. "What happens now?" Marcus asked eventually. "What happens to you, to your people, to Earth?" Keyleth looked out the window at the golden light spilling through the trees. "I do not know," she admitted. "But whatever happens, I will face it, and I will not be afraid. Because you taught me that courage is not about being unafraid. It is about doing what is right, even when you are terrified." She turned to look at him with love shining in her violet eyes. "You taught me that kindness is not weakness, that compassion is not a flaw, that sometimes one person can change everything just by choosing to care." Marcus smiled and reached out to squeeze her hand. "Sounds like you learned those lessons pretty well." "Kid, I had a good teacher," Keyleth replied. And her smile was like the sun breaking through clouds after a long storm. The news of what happened at Earth spread across the galaxy like wildfire, carried by traders and travelers and diplomats to every corner of known space. The story was almost impossible to believe. They said an Allery High Admiral had defied her own government and brought an entire fleet to defend a primitive world that was not even listed in the official records. And she had done it because a single human had shown her kindness 20 years before. The Ascendancy Council was furious. They demanded Keyleth's immediate return, called her a traitor and a disgrace, threatened to strip her of her rank and her titles and her very name. And some of the more extreme voices even called for her execution. But something unexpected happened when they tried to enforce their judgment. People refused to cross 1,000 Allori worlds. Ordinary citizens began to speak out in support of Keyleth. Soldiers who had served under her declared their loyalty. Scholars wrote passionate essays about the meaning of her actions. And artists created works celebrating her courage. They had watched the broadcasts from Earth, seen the humans flying their primitive ships into battle against impossible odds, heard Keyleth's words echoing across the stars. And something inside them had shifted for the first time in millennia. The people of the Ascendancy began to question the old ways. Why did we abandon the weak? They asked, why did we turn our backs on those who needed help? When did efficiency become more important than empathy? When did we forget how to chaos? The council tried to silence the dissent, but it was too late. The revolution had already begun. Not a revolution of violence, but a revolution of the heart. A fundamental shift in how an entire civilization saw itself and its place in the universe. Within months, the old council was dissolved, replaced by new leaders who promised a different kind of future. Leaders who understood that true advancement was not measured in technology or territory, but in the capacity for compassion. And at the center of it all was Kalith. She was not punished for her actions. She was celebrated, and the new ascendancy named her the emissary to Earth, the first official ambassador to the world that had changed everything. The ceremony was broadcast across the galaxy, and billions of beings watched as Kala stood before the assembled leaders of her people and accepted her new role. "I was once a broken child," she said, her wings spread wide and her voice steady with conviction. "Stranded on a world my people considered worthless, left to die by laws that valued efficiency over life. And I would have died alone and forgotten if not for one man." She held up the old brass compass, still worn and dented after all these years. "He found me crying in the forest and he saved me, not for reward or recognition or any benefit to himself, but simply because it was the right thing to do. And that one act of simple human kindness taught me everything I needed to know about what civilization really means." She turned to face the crowd, her violet eyes blazing with passion. "We thought we were advanced. We thought we were superior, but we had lost something precious along the way. We had forgotten that true strength is not found in power or conquest, but in the courage to care for those who cannot care for themselves." Her voice rang out across the stars. "The humans of Earth taught us this lesson. They showed us what we had forgotten. And now it is our duty to carry that lesson forward, to build a new kind of galaxy. One where kindness is not weakness and compassion is not a flaw." The cheers that followed shook the very foundations of the ascendancy. And Keleth smiled because she knew that the change had only just begun on Earth. Things were changing too. Humanity had learned that they were not alone in the universe, that the stars were full of wonders and dangers beyond imagining, and that they had allies now among the great powers of the galaxy. The governments of the world came together in ways they never had before, setting aside old conflicts and ancient grudges to focus on this new era of possibility. And scientists and dreamers began to plan for a future that reached beyond their small blue planet. But the most important change was harder to measure. People looked at each other differently now, saw each other with new eyes, understood in a way they never had before that their greatest strength had never been their weapons or their technology, but their stubborn, beautiful insistence on caring for one another. Because if one old soldier's kindness could echo across the galaxy and change the fate of civilizations, then what other miracles might be possible if people simply chose to be good to each other? Kalith returned to Montana one more time, landing in the clearing outside the cabin on a perfect autumn evening that reminded her of the night she had first fallen to this world. Marcus was waiting for her on the porch, a cup of coffee in his hand and a smile on his weathered face. "I hear you are a big deal now," he said as she approached. "Ambassador to Earth, hero of the ascendancy, the woman who changed the galaxy." Kalith laughed and sat down beside him on the steps. "I suppose I am. But none of it would have happened without you." She leaned her head against his shoulder, her wings folding around them both like a silver blanket. "I came to ask you something," she said softly. "What is it?" "Kid," Kalith hesitated, suddenly feeling like the frightened child she had been 20 years ago. "I know you value your solitude, and I would never want to take that from you. But I was wondering if maybe you might consider letting me visit more often, and maybe even coming to see my world someday. Because I have spent 20 years missing you, and I do not want to spend another 20 the same way." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and then he put his arm around her and squeezed gently. "Kalith, you are the closest thing to family I've had in a very long time, and this cabin has been pretty lonely without you. So yes, I would like that very much." She looked up at him with tears of joy in her violet eyes. Really, he confirmed. Besides, someone has to keep you humble now that you are a big, important ambassador. Might as well be me. They sat together in comfortable silence as the stars came out one by one. And somewhere high above them the Allery fleet hung in orbit. A promise of protection and friendship that would last for generations. The galaxy would never be the same. That much was certain. But Keleth knew in her heart that it was changing for the better, and it had all started with one simple act of kindness. One man who found a winged girl crying in the woods and chose to help her. And that single choice had rippled outward through time and space, until it transformed everything. The old man and the alien ambassador sat together and watched the stars. And both of them knew that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together because that was what family did. And that was the greatest lesson humanity had to teach the universe. That love and kindness were not weaknesses to be overcome, but strengths to be cultivated. The foundation upon which all true civilizations must be built and high above the earth. Painted on the side of a gleaming silver flagship, the words Vance's compass caught the light of distant suns. A permanent reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of goodness can change the entire course of history.